Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm finally talking about the new album from Banco de Gaia, Trauma. Alright, I'm pretty late to this one. I've been meaning to get around to it for a few months now, since this dropped back in September, and it was announced, I want to say, back in like May or something, but yeah, today we're finally going to be talking about longtime ambient house, ambient dub, and worldbeat producer Toby Marks, aka Banco de Gaia. This is technically an artist I've talked about once before. Way back in 2016, I made a video covering his last album, The Ninth of Nine Hearts, and I even did an in-brief segment very quickly going through his back catalog. I'll link that video in the description if you're curious, though that video is obviously very old and from the days when I was still pretty new to this whole reviewing thing. I haven't bothered to rewatch it myself. Anyway, this is an artist whose work was pretty formative to me in high school. I found out about him through a random recommendation from Pandora Radio and got pretty hooked on his stuff for a while. Always found his style combining standard dub and techno and down-tempo blends with widely varied world music instrumentation to really grab me and stood out to me as really unique. His sophomore album, Last Train to Lhasa, I marked as one of my favorites of all time when I put together that list in 2016 as well. Always found the mashups of samples and old school 90s techno grooves to just be a great fit for my typical taste. With that said, it's been 8 years since the last time he came out with an album, and he hasn't been in regular listening rotation aside from the occasional spin of either of his first two albums every now and then. And there was a little part of me who wondered how much his stuff would really hold up to me nowadays now that so much in the world has changed and my tastes have changed. I knew that a common word that came up both in criticism of his work as well as one that came to mind when I heard his stuff myself was cheesy. I knew a lot of his stuff had a pretty lighthearted and goofy tone to it. Would that possibly come off as unintentionally mocking of the other cultures he took influence from? I don't know, but I had a lot of good memories with his work, so I made sure to go back and refresh myself on his back catalog. And minor spoilers before I get into that, I don't think my fears turned out to be nearly as warranted as I expected. Pretty much all his old stuff held up to me in some form, and none of it was ever cringeworthy in the way I was worried it might be. As much cultural mishmashing as he does, and as playful or even intentionally goofy as the results can be, I never felt like he was ever being disrespectful with the influences he took, and it always felt very earnest without feeling like a novelty to me. Dated, sure, the whole bring the world together attitude his stuff often had, it does feel like a uniquely 90s thing that you might not be as likely to see in the same way out of an artist breaking out right now. Maybe even more 80s attitude-wise if you look back on the similarity to an artist like, say, Ryuichi Sakamoto, who also did a lot of cultural mishmashing back then. But a novelty? No. I think I can still go to bat for him as legit and still deserving of respect and worth people's time to go back to. And to illustrate, I will once again go through my thoughts on his studio album discography so far, in a bit more detail this time. Right, so this is functionally his debut. He did technically self-release 2 cassette-only albums before this called Medium and Freeform Flutes and Fading Tibetans, though thanks to sample clearance issues, those albums are extremely rare and not available for legal streaming. Also, a couple of tracks from both albums, including Mafik Arabi and Laila, were reworked into this one. Anyway, this is one of the most 90s things you've ever heard. Lots of glittering ambient techno and dub grooves with some tight Indian and Middle Eastern instrumentation, and some sampled chanting here and there. It's pretty similar to something like, say, William Orbit's Strange Cargo 3, although quite frankly, this is better than that album in nearly every way. There's no individual track here as good as Water from a Vine Leaf, though it's far more consistent and better paced as a full album, roughly equally as long, but none of the tracks feel like filler and could all be considered standouts. As obviously dated as it might be at this point, if you like 90s ambient dub and acid house and that stuff, I think this still totally holds up as a great album. Although, this is just an all-around improved version of what he did on Maya, featuring a wider instrumental palette with more varied influences, including samples and instrumentation from African, Chinese, and other Asian cultures, even catchier and more easily memorable arrangements, an entire bonus disc of alternate hyper-extended ambient dub versions of tracks that, well, I personally don't enjoy as much as the first disc, really grabbed a lot of other people even more. And there's even a bit of social commentary with messages about China's colonization localization of Tibet in the album's liner notes. I've already gone on record for this being my easy favorite of his albums, as well as marking it among my favorites of all time when I put together that list in 2016, and I still stand by that. Used to bump this all the time in high school and still love it anytime I put it on nowadays. Probably the best starting point for those uninitiated to his work. Now, for this one, he moved further away from the catchier accessibility of his first two records towards much more of an open-ended and cosmic improvisational sort of feel, kinda like the second disc of Last Train to Lhasa. The first half of this album focuses on similar kinds of heavy, grooving ambient dub and techno arrangements of the variety he'd done before, albeit without really trying to form hooks. But the second half, i.e. the last two tracks, just goes for an entirely ambient approach, with even lengthier cuts that very much bring the orb to mind. While I may have personally preferred the accessibility of his first two albums, this one is also great. It has a particular flavor to it that wouldn't really be heard again to the same extent on any of his other stuff, and it deservedly has a lot of people willing to go to bat for it as his best work as a result. And this is another interesting swerve in the exact opposite direction. For this album, he started bringing in a lot more breakbeats and went out of his way to make this feel like more of a lighthearted and silly affair with much goofier choices and samples. There are some parts of this album that I swear have like a Fatboy Slim or Propellerheads kind of vibe to them. Like he saw Big Beat getting a lot of success at the time and was like, oh, that shit slaps. I'm gonna try my hand at some of that too, while also combining it with his usual ambient and world music stuff. I suppose your mileage may vary on how good an idea that might sound to you on paper, but I do think those influences are successfully able to mesh well together into something compelling. This used to be one of my biggest favorites of his albums when I was a kid, and while I think it shrunk on me a tiny bit on return listen, I do still think it slaps. This one kind of tries to find a middle ground between the more improvisational feeling experimentalism of Big Men Cry and the catchier accessibility of Magical Sounds, and ends up with the average of what you'd expect out of a Banco de Gaia album at that point, I guess. I do remember struggling with this one a little in high school, out of finding it to run together too much without being as easily memorable as his earlier stuff. And that's still kind of the case, though it was at least better than I remembered coming back to it for this video. I will still argue it was easily his least consistent up to this point. Like, the last two tracks are pretty weak. There's maybe a cut or two like Cream Egg that falls in the background. But, you know, everything else is quality enough for this still to be worth hearing on both on the explorative ambient and catchy banger end. There's also two vocal tracks with Jennifer Fulker that give me a little bit of a Jean-Michel Jarre Metamorphoses kind of vibe, which I can mess with. Okay, you know, this was another album I don't remember messing with that much when I was in high school, but this held up way better than I remembered. There is a poppier edge to this one, with both tight synth-pop-ish vocal cuts and a couple of ambient-leaning ballads. A heck of an epic 1-2 punch to start the album off as well. And one absolutely insane political track called Waking Up in Waco, which takes this massive-sounding breakbeat and piles on a whole bunch of news broadcasts and various samples themed around American imperialism and wealth inequality and all sorts of other things going wrong in America. I used to find that track kind of annoying and musically incoherent, but now it's just kind of existentially terrifying how perfectly it fits for this current moment in time 20 years later. The more things change, the more things stay the same, I guess. Yeah, I did not give this album enough credit. It's really good. And on the opposite end of the coin, this was one I remember messing with more when I was in high school and didn't really hold up as well coming back to it now. It's still a good album, to be clear, mostly pivoting back away from the poppier elements, aside from the ridiculously schmaltzy and long-winded closer, which I did not care for at all. This might even be my least favorite track Banco de Gaia has ever done. But everything else goes back towards the entirely instrumental, cosmic vibing heard on something like Ijize. And the result definitely has its standout moments like Karakum and Saturn Return. But a lot of this just kind of ended up to a more generic mid-tempo vibe that didn't really have that distinct a flavor to me and kind of fell in the background. Bit of a shame since that's one of his best album covers, I feel like. Again, it's nice, but not essential. Kind of similar feelings on this one. This is another one of his most background music-y listens, and I remember this used to be my least favorite of his albums, though yet again my feelings changed coming back to it, and it grew on me. I at least like this more than Farewell Pharyngistan now, since I think there's more organic texture going into it, even if there's almost nothing in the way of hooks. There's a lot of really pretty and well-textured stuff on here that can almost feel movie soundtrack ready, and a sense of emotional weight and maturity to the general tone of everything that his earlier stuff didn't have in the same way, and I could definitely appreciate. At least aside from the one sillier moment, Eternal Sunshine, but that had a nice bounce to it too. Yeah, I can give this album a thumbs up as well. And then there's the album I already reviewed and also marked as one of my favorites of that year on my 2016 year-end list. This is a step down production-wise from Apollo, and it was still weird to run into a couple of royalty-free loops on this one that I've also used in my own music. But I'm not too bothered by that, especially since A, the production is still just well-polished and detailed sounding enough where someone who didn't coincidentally buy the exact same sample pack as he did probably wouldn't notice any major difference in production quality. And more importantly, B, the actual compositions are way catchier and more memorable than anything he'd come out with in years. Both successfully delivering the heartfelt emotional moments they're going for, but with some of his best hooks since At Least You Are Here, if not even further back. So, yeah, I pretty much stand by my feelings as expressed in that old review I did. Which finally brings us to here. So yeah, it's been 8 years since the 99 Hearts. That time admittedly hasn't been completely silent for Marks. He did put out some ambient work under his real name in collaboration with Andrew Heath. There was a Banco de Gaia EP called Kintsugi around 2020 as well, but that was about it. Also in that time, Marks had to deal with a lot of family issues, including both of his parents declining in health, and obviously the greater world at large has seen pretty much everything going to shit with the rise of modern fascism, and multiple wars and war crimes such as those in Ukraine and Palestine. Not to mention climate change only having gotten astronomically worse, and the rise of AI tech, which will be relevant to mention, we'll get into that. And now he's making something inspired by just how much trauma the entire world has been put through since the last time he put out an album, as per the title, while also doing his absolute best to find the light in the darkness of the time we live in. And the results are about as solid as you'd expect. While this isn't as catchy an album as the 99 Hearts, nor is it among his most polished productions, he's still delivering all the thumping techno and dub and downtempo and prog influence stuff, with all the usual wide-ranging world music influences, and I would say this is a fun listen. Maybe it's a little on the front-loaded side. The first half of this project was definitely stronger for me than the second half. The album starts out quite strong in its entirely ambient opener, Myrrh, having a lot of really nice saxophone performances care of Matthew Jenkins, and then as we move into a B song, the typical Banco de Gaia formulas start to kick into gear with lots of thumping beat work, buzzing bass, of course, B song, and a prominent lead vocal sample adapted from a 1954 Damara praise song sourced by Future Pasts, which is like an ongoing arts and humanities research project based in West Namibia. The track feels like pretty standard fare for him, but, you know, that praise song does make for a solid hook. Draig Do, or however you say that, sorry, that goes for more of a cinematic trip-hop sort of flavor with all these nice synth strings and choirs and squirting synth lines that sort of bring his early Maya Heliopolis era to mind, and features understated spoken Simreg poetry, sorry if I've mispronounced that as well, delivered by Sarah Louise Wheeler and dedicated in memory to Annie Whelans. It is definitely one of the album's deepest emotional moments, and one of the nicest and most well-textured mixes on display here. It does feel like the sadness of loss is carrying over it. But then we move into my personal favorite track, War, which has easily the best hook out of any track on this album, with all these chopped up spoken samples going, "What's the question? War!" in a bunch of different voices and sticking in the head really easily. Also going over a lot of really propulsive house beats and mildly aggressive bass synths that sort of give me like a Spunk Shine vibe, and other expansive pads. I mean, it's not exactly a deep message, it's just trying to promote love over hate and whatnot. What's the question? War. What's the answer? Love! Of course. But it is really damn epic, easily replayable, just a lot of fun. And I also had a lot of fun with My Little Country, which delivers a lot more propulsive acid techno banging with a whole extended narration talking about the mildly amusing story of the Principality of Sealand, like that tiny sea fort that tried to establish itself as a sovereign nation, and the person running it, Roy Bates, self-appointing himself as prince since his position wasn't by democratic election. That track's a bit of a goofy novelty, isn't really trying to be as serious as other cuts surrounding it, but, you know, it still bangs well enough. Now, the album's second half does start to mark a slight bit of a downturn, starting with a track that is all but guaranteed to be controversial with people in Electric Sheep. A bit of a quirky banger in the style of older tracks of his like Eternal Sunshine, except he decided to AI generate all the vocals through a machine learning model called Refusion. To be abundantly clear, from the way this track is advertised, I do think Marks has his reservations with the rise of this tech and is more like ambivalent and conflicted on it. He admits right in the Bandcamp description that he feels it has the potential for both good and bad, which I agree with, even if the bad is way more obvious and easy to find. The track even starts with a quick spoken sample talking about the insane amount of resources required for a computer with the capabilities of a human brain to even exist, and writing the idea off as impossible. This track's existence seems to be a bit of a one-off experiment or even a quick novelty that isn't meant to be repeated again, merely acting as another snapshot of the current times we live in. As far as I'm concerned, this is a pretty harmless use of AI tech, even kinda intentionally leaning into the tech's inherent limitations, generating vocals that aren't coherent at all and sound like an undefined blur of white people making weird noises over an admittedly pretty solidly banging dub-flavored beat. I think the track is perfectly fine, I don't take any personal issue with it. Though I do also know how thoroughly poisoned this well has become in the discourse and how socially unacceptable it's become to use AI in your art at all. So if you're one of those people who feel like the mere association with using generative AI tech in any context is a deal breaker, either thanks to all the natural resources required to use that kind of tech in the first place, or, tech companies carte blanche data harvesting of the entire internet and unpaid exploitation of artists' work used as training data to make that tech work, I would understand that. Even if I stand by my previous stances of the tech itself not being the problem, as someone who's always been very pro-sampling and anti-copyright law, I think the technology's actual capabilities are way more limited than it's marketed to be, and I would much rather decry the harm caused by giant corporations forcing this tech into everything in order to cut costs on actually paying people to do work while using up more natural resources than ever, and also making their own products way shittier and harder to use in the process. Instead of ragging on this one semi-obscure electronic artist using the same tech to make weird noises in one song. That is fine. Though I will say the track did not necessarily need the AI-generated stuff to work. In terms of what it's actually like to listen to, the effect would have been exactly the same if you took out all the AI-generated samples and replaced them with regular vocal samples that, got processed and filtered a lot. But anyway... With that massive digression, the rest of this album is also nice, and I don't have nearly as complicated thoughts on any of the remaining tracks. Though as the album closes up, I do feel like my interest starts to wane. Mode Dia is a neat 7.5-minute ambient epic with a lot of prog influences and spoken samples themed after religion and why people turn to it. Although this track was definitely undercut for me by the drumming, which is really thin sounding. It's like trying to sound like live drumming, but instead sounds like it could have come from a VST or something. Not nearly enough punch to the percussion to get that track to go the extra mile. Endure fares much better in that department, both in its heavier percussion, but also its more epic blasts of bass and noise and synth arpeggios and pained-sounding vocal samples. That was probably the best cut in the second half, and I didn't even mind the way it just ended in a hard cut out of nowhere at the end. It kind of reminded me of the Beatles' I Want You, She's So Heavy, in the way it kind of built up and cut off like that. And then the album ends with The Dying Light, a nice little ambient cut to sort of bring the album back full circle, with lots of pleasantly emotional pads and violin solos, although it didn't hit as strong an emotional note for me or feel as striking as the album opener. Maybe felt a bit anticlimax as a finish, although he has ended albums on more underwhelming notes than that before. So that's finally everything to go through on Trauma. It's definitely a Banco de Gaia album, alright? I don't know if I'd necessarily put this among his best. It's actually probably one of his lower tier albums, but that's not saying as much as I would have thought it might before I started work on this video. His overall catalog is a lot more consistent than I remembered, and this does live up to the same standards I would want a new release from him to live up to. Is it going to be a year-end list contender? Also no. You can probably add this onto the list of merely good but not great comeback albums we've gotten over the course of 2024, as well as most likely adding to the list of videos I've put out this year that took a lot of work to put together and will inevitably be underperforming views-wise. But hey, at least I had fun putting all of this together and going through these old memories and finding that I can still get as much out of his work as I used to a decade ago, as well as finally catching up to where he is now. Even if things don't look optimistic for the world at large right about now, I do at least hope for the best for Toby Marks himself and that he's able to get through any personal struggles and make it to the light at the end of whatever tunnel he may be in. And I'm glad we got this nice little album along the way. I'm overall feeling 7.5 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.
What's the question? War.